Hi, I want to talk to you today about, is support for Israel becoming partisan? Is that possible? Since President Harry Truman, as the first foreign leader to recognize the new nation of Israel, Israel has enjoyed bipartisan support in the United States. Tragically, that may be changing, but the whys and what to do about it may be surprising. In God's famous declaration to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where he said Abraham would be the father of a great nation, he also said that those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. Throughout history, there's been a remarkable consistency of nations who welcomed the Jews and treated them well, who were blessed, and then those who persecuted the Jews were cursed. One of the greatest examples is actually the United States. The first Jews that arrived to the U.S. came from Brazil, and they went to New York. After the Revolutionary War, George Washington wrote a letter to the Newport, Rhode Island congregation, the country's oldest synagogue, welcoming them and guaranteeing freedom of worship. Jews began to immigrate to the United States in significant numbers in the mid-19th century. Throughout most American history, Jews were readily accepted and prospered far more than any other country in world history. Consequently, I believe that God blessed the United States as it became the most powerful country in the world and the most prosperous in world history. After the Holocaust and World War II, the Zionist movement began lobbying various countries to support the establishment of a safe haven for Jews in a new nation planted on the original Promised Land. Under President Truman, the United States supported the proposal before the United Nations. And of course, Israel declared her independence on May 14, 1948. At the time, most of the church world was apathetic. Churches in the Middle East actively opposed the establishment of the new state. But after Israel won the War of Independence, church leaders began to take note. They began to relook at the Bible. Traditionally, Christians saw the church as a replacement for Jews in God's plan. But through the remarkable events of the reestablishment of the nation of Israel, they began to see the fulfillment of the ancient prophecies of Jews returning to the land. Also, the church began to rethink its theology about Jews, recognizing that much of its teaching led to persecution of Jews, culminating in the Holocaust. They began to see Jews as partners with Christians in God's plan for the world. The 1960s saw a dramatic alteration of Christian views towards Jews and ultimately Israel. Vatican Council II of the Catholic Church led to a huge reconsideration of Catholic theology and practice on numerous fronts, and through that acknowledged for the first time that Jews were not responsible for Jesus' death. This view had contributed to the death of millions of Jews. The Civil Rights Movement, which was mostly to address the discrimination against African Americans, but it also led to more acceptance of Jews and enabled them to rise to the highest levels of American society, including my father. The 1967 Six-Day War saw the swift victory of Israel over 3 Arab nations, including the retaking of Jerusalem. That fueled the theological changes taking place where more were seeing Israel as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And finally, the Jesus movement of the late 60s and early 70s saw large numbers of Jewish young people come to faith. Most of them were pro-Israel, which further strengthened the church's connections to Israel. But the most consequential change was the rise of the moral majority in the late 1970s. Jerry Falwell, the founder of the moral majority, forged a significant friendship with Menachem Begin, then Israel's prime minister, and through his organization's support behind Israel and her political actions. Since that time, almost all of evangelical Christianity's political organizations became avid supporters of Israel and her government. This is one of the most significant changes in the history of Christianity. A religion historically anti-Semitic and responsible for the deaths of millions of Jews, now suddenly the most ardent supporter of the nation of Israel and its policies. Again, this change was limited to mostly evangelical churches and those largely in the United States. But who can argue with such a positive development? But is it all positive? I've shared in past messages that evangelical Christianity has become increasingly associated with the Republican Party. Evangelical leaders openly endorse Republican politicians. Evangelicals have become a significant constituency of the Republican Party. And as I've said before, I have no criticisms personally of the Republican Party. I'm a Republican myself, so no problems there. But in contrast, most Jews in America are affiliated with the Democratic Party. Historically, support for Israel in the U.S. was centered in Jewish communities and their political contacts. In 1951, as an outgrowth of the Zionist movement, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, was formed. AIPAC is a lobbying organization whose goal is to support the interests of Israel in U.S. public policy. For most of its history, the leadership and membership of the organization was largely confined to the American Jewish community. But in more recent years, American evangelicals have joined and swelled the organization's membership and conference attendance. This all sounds great, except the political values of most Jews and evangelical Christians are polar opposites, especially over social and cultural issues. Over the last several years, evangelical Christians have broadly supported the nation of Israel's more provocative actions, such as Jewish settlements in the West Bank and her treatment of the Palestinian people. Many evangelical leaders see the expansion of Israel's borders as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, whereas this view is not shared by most American Jews, who actually oppose expansion of the settlements. The breaking point in partisanship, however, was the decision of Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu to accept an invitation by the Republican House and Senate leadership to speak to a joint session of Congress in 2015 opposing then President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. Regardless of one's view of the agreement, and I found it to be problematic, a leader of one country never goes to another country to publicly denounce the initiative of the other country's leader. It was a stupid and short-sighted move. Numerous Democratic members of Congress found the move patently offensive, leading to a partisan divide over Israel for the first time. The situation became exacerbated with the actions of now President Trump. Since his election, he unilaterally withdrew the nation from the Iran deal, moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, unfunded the Palestinian Authority, and proposed a blatantly one-sided peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. While one or more of these actions may have merit, the reality is Trump began unraveling over 70 years of U.S. and bipartisan policy towards Israel. As a result, for the first time in U.S. history, major political leaders are questioning U.S. support for Israel. Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, the only Jewish candidate for the nomination, sharply criticized Israel's policies towards the Palestinians and questioned ongoing support for the country. Other candidates have done the same. The Israeli government's proposals to annex part of the West Bank are making the partisan divide even worse. Knowing that if Democrats win the presidency in the November election and that they will oppose annexation, the Israeli government is pushing for annexation now. Now, many, if not most of my viewers probably will say, well, who cares about the Democratic Party? They're obviously opposing the will of God. But are they? Where does it say in the Bible that followers of Yeshua are to universally support the political policies of another nation? What is God's promise to Abraham that those who bless Abraham and his descendants have to do with supporting a modern nation's political agenda, even if it is Israel? While the Bible promises the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants, who is to say what its boundaries are supposed to be? They change constantly in the biblical period. Should followers of Yeshua support the unjust and unlawful taking of Arab private lands where they've lived for generations by Jewish settlement expansion and annexation? Doesn't this violate basic biblical prohibitions such as stealing or coveting your neighbor's property? How does the Bible view the treatment of aliens and strangers in our midst? Doesn't the Bible promote peace? How does unilateral annexation promote peace? Suffice to say that each of these questions are complex theologically. Interestingly, these are the questions that the American Jewish community constantly wrestles with. The real tragedy here is that Israel's future relations with the United States are being undermined by partisanship. It doesn't and shouldn't be that way. As a follower of Yeshua, Our goal should be to seek God's will done for all of humanity. His will certainly includes the welfare of the Jewish people and the nation of Israel, but it also includes the welfare of the Arabs, their property, and their history. I do not believe blindly supporting all of Israel's policies are God's will. Since one of the two major political parties in the United States has now become aligned with evangelical Christianity, support for Israel now tragically is becoming partisan. As I said in earlier messages, our voice as followers of Yeshua should be a prophetic one in political discourse. We should be calling all nations to uphold justice. Israel as a nation and a people are called by God to be a light to the nations. We should be spurring Israel to fulfill her destiny through the righteous treatment of all people. We should be the ones to applaud godly actions, but condemn ungodly ones. Criticizing Israel's government for wrongful acts is not a sign of disloyalty to God or the nation. It's what we're called to do. Let's be excited for all that Israel has accomplished and for what God has supernaturally done in bringing his people back to the land. Let's support policies that both uphold the integrity of the nation, but also meet the standards of justice outlined in the Bible. Remember Yeshua's words, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Let's hunger and thirst for righteousness in our policies for all people. Thank you, and see you next time.